This is a very complicated question, and I wanted to start reverently and respectfully because it has some very delicate implications. I want to start with a reading from the Quran. The word Quran means recitation, so I'm going to give a recitation of the recitation. And of course, it's the recitation of God's words. And each of the sections of the Quran are called surahs, and each one begins with a saying like this: in the name of God, merciful to all, compassionate to each. Praise be to God, Lord of the worlds, merciful to all, compassionate to each, Lord of the day of judgment. It is you we worship, and upon you we call for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those upon whom your grace abounds, not those upon whom anger falls, nor those who are lost. In a sense, that says a great deal about what I'm going to talk about today. My title, of course, is a quotation, and I'm going to go to the source of where I got this quotation. Islam is mercy, and its attributes are merciful. And then the question, how Islamic is the Islamic State? I can almost tell you the conclusion. It depends on who you talk to. And I'm not a Muslim, so anything I would say is from the outside. But even inside, it would depend on whom you talk to. Islam is a religion of action. Human actions conform to God's will. And those action and God's will are known through Muhammad, the prophet, who received and then recited the Quran, which is God's words. And then later generations made a conclusion that they would be following God's will if they followed Muhammad's example. And as we're going to see, the word example is sunnah in Arabic, and thus someone who follows Muhammad's example is a Sunni Muslim. And for the most part, I'm not speaking about Shiite Muslims today. In contrast to Christianity, Christianity is a religion of redemption from sin through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And of course, Jesus died executed on a cross. So I want to just use the word, through defeat comes victory. And following Christ, in many senses, that phrase, take up one's cross and follow me. So I use that in contrast to the fact that Muhammad, who lived from 570 to 632, he died having won a great victory over his opponents in the city of Mecca. And thus, victory at the conclusion of his life was the sign. I think this leads me up to a statement about what has been called the Great Reversal. And the last 30 to 40 years have been, even longer than that, Muslim attempts to reverse the Great Reversal. Now, what's the Great Reversal? Muhammad dies in 632. For the next 1,200 years, down to around the year 1690, the Ottoman Empire around the Middle East, around the Mediterranean, and the Mughal Empire in India ruled, and the Martian landing anywhere in West Asia all the way to Europe would have said the dominant force, culturally, politically, and religiously on the planet was Islam. And in 1690s, Islam, the Ottoman Turks that is, actually got to the gates of Vienna and laid siege to the capital city of Austria. And if they had prevailed there, then the southern portion of Germany would all swept in. At that time, the Ottoman Turks ruled all the way up to Hungary and included most of Hungary, Romania, what is now Southeast Europe, in its realm. Of course, what happens, and this is the great dilemma, from 1690 down to 1920, 1924, in 1920 and 1924, all of India was ruled by British, and 1/3 of the population of India was Muslim. They had taken over the reins from the Mughal Empire. In 1920-24, the Ottoman Empire had completely fallen apart, And except for Turkey, which remained independent, no portion of the Ottoman Empire was under self-rule. It was being ruled by the British, the French, the Italians, and then, not to speak of the largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, which was being colonized by the Netherlands, Malaysia by the British. The Philippines, with a large Muslim population, was being ruled by the Americans. And there was an ongoing struggle, civil war, in some ways it's still going on 100 years later in the southern Philippines. Of course, that's 1920-24. Turkey managed to free itself up, expelled all the Greeks from Asia Minor, and had an independent Turkish country. Gradually, countries became independent. Persia or Iran achieved mostly free independence by the end of the Second World War. Afghanistan never was under the rule of anyone to this very day. And probably Central Arabia, the Saudi realm, was independent. But everywhere else, if you stop and think, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and then India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, which would have been about 90% of the Muslim population of the world, was all being ruled colonially. And then after the Second World War, each one of those countries became independent and assumed it. But they became independent countries. And that's one of my themes today. What is a country? What is a nation or a nation state? So, this great reversal, according to the Muslim ethos established in the first 1,200 years, victory, predominance, rule, according to the will of God, was God's will for the world. And the fact that it succeeded was a sign of God's presence. When it receded, then either God's not what God says he is, or something's wrong with the Muslim community that would happen. That's a broad strokes interpretation. However, this lecture or presentation is about the Islamic State. So I want to begin with some conflicting voices about this question. First of all, President Obama, just a couple of weeks ago said, ISIL, that's an acronym for the Islamic State, is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents, and the vast majority of ISIL's victims have been Muslim. Last week, United States drones and guided missiles from the cruisers tried to take out the leadership of ISIL. And apparently they didn't succeed, at least not with the Caliph Ibrahim. But it is thought that maybe 50 to 150 bystanders, innocents, died. Those of us who vote in the United States condone it. We've been doing it for several decades. So one of my things is I want to unpack statements like that. One of the themes of this is that legitimate use of force, this goes back to Weber's definition of a state. A state is the entity that reserves to itself a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence and force. In the United States, no religion has the ability to exercise violence or force. By definition, that's our government's role, and they do it. So in that sense, we can condone it, we can oppose it, but a religion in the Western world doesn't exercise violence or force by definition. And that's part of being a nation state. And of course, the whole world is now divided up, with the exception of Antarctica, into nation states, and no one's allowed to not be a citizen of a nation state. Everyone's got to be one. That's the way the world's set up. And that's the aftermath of Western imperialism and colonialism. And that severely affected, probably implemented the Great Reversal, and it affects the Muslim attempts to reverse the Great Reversal. Okay, that was President Obama. there is a report that Muhammad had said, "My community shall never agree on an error." The word agree is going to be very important. There's plenty of disagreement, but when they are in agreement, that has God's backing. So the never applies to the agreement, not the error. There'll always be errors, but when there's an agreement, that's not an error. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. One of the foundational documents of Islam from the 8th and 9th century by a man named Ash-Shafi'i said, he wrote something called the Fiqh Akbar, the great jurisprudence. He said, "We do not consider anyone to be an infidel on account of sin, nor do we deny his faith." Very important theme tonight, this afternoon. A Muslim doesn't have to be a saint to be a Muslim. The person can believe and not practice, or imperfectly practice. Of course, that was a crucial issue in Christianity as well. You know, we say every day, "Pray for us sinners." At least the Catholics among us. Pray for us sinners. That doesn't make me not a Christian, the fact that I'm a sinner. The poor practice of Islam, according to the mainstream Sunni tradition, and Ash-Shafi'i is one of the founders of it, is the determination that all Muslims are Muslims just by the simple faith, there is no God but God, Muhammad is his messenger. Now that ought to lead to practice in conformity with God's will, but largely it doesn't always happen. That doesn't make you not a Muslim. It's going to be a very crucial point for this presentation. We enjoin what is just and prohibit what is evil. In the great Sunni tradition, even if you don't actually live up to the perfect practice of what is good or avoid all evil, you should at least promote and join the good and prohibit the evil. And the verbs in Arabic have to do with attempting to do that, not definitively being able to achieve it. And then differences of opinion in the community are a token of divine mercy. Because without this, the center of the heart of the Sunni tradition, factions would have split up, and it was actually bloody and led to a number of civil wars. So this is like an agreement to have peace in the community that is allowed disagreement. Now, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, he's the official spokesperson for, like the press secretary for the Islamic State. Back on April 3rd, he said this: "God bless Prophet Muhammad, who was sent with the sword as a mercy to all worlds." And that was in a speech promoting jihad, which I'm going to talk about, and calling for adherence to the Islamic State, on the principle that Muhammad himself had set up an Islamic State in Medina and Mecca before he died in 632. So if we're following Muhammad's example, he used military means to set up a state, so can the present people do it. Again, there's an interpretational principle here. In response to that and to the general cry from the West, United States and many Great Britain and other places, asking the Muslim community to stand up and say something about the Islamic State, and for their own internal reasons, not just because we asked them, but 129 Sunni muftis and Islamic scholars met and agreed on a statement called the Open Letter. And the genre is they wrote a letter to Caliph Ibrahim, who is the head of the Islamic State. In that, they, in the second paragraph, explicitly cite the previous statement and challenge it precisely on interpretation. Here's what they said, September 19th. "This statement comprises compounded confusions and a mistaken paradigm. Now, God sent the Prophet Muhammad as a mercy to all the worlds. Quote, "We did not send you except as a mercy to all the worlds." That's God's words in the Quran. However, they go on to say, "This is true for all time and all place. The prophet was sent as a mercy to people, animals, plants, to the heavens, and to subtle beings. No Muslims disagree about this. So maybe you can pass these back. Or Janice, maybe Janice. Oops. There are more here if anybody needs them. There we go. Let me just start this open letter again because it's very important. And this, in English, it's about 17 pages. I have a copy of it if anyone is interested. This statement comprises compounded confusions and a mistaken paradigm. Now, God sent the Prophet Muhammad as a mercy to all the worlds. In the Quran it says, "We did not send you except as a mercy to all the worlds." This is true for all time and place. And in the Sunni mainstream tradition, this is considered, that's exactly what they mean. Some of the statements in the Quran are specific to a time and place. Some of them transcend time and place. And that statement is one of them. No Muslims agree about this. It is a general and unconditional statement taken from the Quran itself. However, the phrase "sent with the sword" is part of a hadith. I'm going to explain a hadith in a couple of minutes. That's a report about something Muhammad said. So with the sword is something Muhammad said. As a mercy is something God said. That is specific to a certain time and place which has since expired. Therefore, the open letter and all those Islamic scholars are saying to the Islamic State that Muhammad used the sword from 621, 622 to 632 when he died in a war between two Arab cities, Medina and Mecca, which he prevailed, was for that time and that place, and wasn't a model for all ages. So they're going to, in effect, accusing the Islamic State of confusing two different things, and thus making generalizable something that took place in Muhammad's life that was specific to his life. Thus, it is forbidden to mix the Quran and Hadith in this way, as it is forbidden to mix the general and the specific, and the conditional and the unconditional. Now, I'm a scholar of Christianity as well. Similar concepts run up and down the whole history of Christian theology. I'll give an example. One of the Gospels says, "Call no man father." That's immediately next to the statement about forbidding divorce. Now, Christians have decided Jesus didn't mean no one to be called father for all time, but at least the Catholic and Orthodox traditions held to the principle of no divorce. So how do you do that? You have an interpretation, you're interpreting a scripture in a certain way. And it's a principle that makes it very livable. You can extend it through time. The Muslims have been doing that same kind of a principle since the 8th and 9th centuries. Now, with that in mind, those are conflicting voices. Obama being an outsider, I went back to Muhammad, I went back to al-Shafi'i, and then to two conflicting statements from this very year, 2014. Now, where does the genealogy of the Islamic State, where does it come from? In 1999, in Iraq, a man named Zarqawi started an organization translated in English as the Organization of Monotheism and Jihad. Now, I'm going to leave jihad unexplained until a little bit later. In 2004, of course, 2001, 9/11 intervenes. He adhered publicly in his organization, and this is after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He started an organization and renamed it the Organization of Jihad's Base in Mesopotamia. Of course, that's Iraq. Although technically Mesopotamia also includes northern Syria. Okay. In 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq which was another name usually given by Western journalists to avoid using the word Mesopotamia in the newspapers where no one would know what Mesopotamia was. They emerged with other insurgent groups to form the Mujahideen Shura Council. And then Zarqawi was killed by an American airstrike. In 2006, this council merged with more factions and announced the establishment of the Islamic State of Iraq. And there's going to be two men here named al-Baghdadi, but the first one became the emir, the leader. Real power lay with the Egyptian Abu Ayyub al-Masri. They were both killed in a U.S.-Iraqi operation in the Anbar province. That's where, if you remember back those years, one of the things the surge was to sweep the western part of Iraq, and they swept al-Qaeda in Iraq underground, virtually disappeared. In 2000, I made a mistake there, it's 2013. Last year, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi became the leader. He had previously been a prisoner of the Americans for 4 years in southern Iraq. I'm not quite clear why he was let go. I think the Americans had too many prisoners and they were just letting him go. Apparently they used their time in prison well because they formed the networks that they were going to use when the prisoners were released and set them up once they got out of prison. He appointed many former Ba'ath Party members, that is Saddam Hussein's regime, particularly from the military. They were absorbed, the Sunnis were absorbed into his organization. This gave it a much broader attraction to Iraqi Sunni Muslims who felt very much oppressed by the Shiite majority. That is, and thus that forms the basis for the Civil War. In 2000, last year ago, April, they expanded into Syria. And thus the Islamic State of Iraq joined with the al-Nusra Front, which was allied with al-Qaeda. And John Kerry and the Secretary of Defense were just recently claiming that al-Nusra, in contrast to the Islamic State, are moderate Muslims. So who's a moderate and who's an extremist from the American point of view depends closely on who can we win favor with and who can't we. And I apologize if I sound critical of American policy. I actually am on some of these points. The head of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, now he's the hidden head of the Osama bin Laden al-Qaeda. He disagreed with this merger and ruled against it. So they split up again. So in February this year, it led to a formal break of the Islamic State from al-Nusra Front and from al-Qaeda. Rather ironically, this is an dispute between two groups that are on our United Nations and the United States list of terrorist organizations. The latter, al-Qaeda and the al-Nusra Front, their main purpose was to overthrow the Assad regime in Syria. And thus the United States has been indirectly feeding them weapons and arms and support. Probably they also did the same thing for the Islamic State, who are heavily armed, either with captured weapons or weapons that were maybe delivered by the Israelis or filtered through from the Gulf states or from Saudi Arabia into the region. On the Sunni side, not on the Shiite side. However, ISIL, the Islamic State, decided not to just overthrow the Assad regime. They're going to set up a new country. And one of the purposes of a Sunni country is to make sure there are as few minority, like Shiites and other people, in the territory as possible. And that's why they seized a good deal of northern and western Syria, and then merged it into a single state, and that's their proclamation, of northern and western Iraq. So in June 29th, they renamed that as the Islamic State and declared this a caliphate with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as Caliph Ibrahim. The last caliph was overthrown in 1920 when the Ottoman Empire dissolved. and the word caliph means successor. It's a successor to Muhammad's roles, but not in his role as prophet. So he was a military, political, social, community leader. So that there should be a single caliph for the entire Muslim world. And here, for the first time since 1920, someone's claiming that they've been appointed caliph. That's quite a significant proclamation for Sunni Muslims. Seeking thus to gain control of the global jihadist movement by having their own country. And that would then establish them internationally. This Islamic State now, in this month, controls territory in Iraq and Syria about the size of Pennsylvania. If you've ever driven across Pennsylvania, it takes you all day at 80 miles an hour. So this is a big swath of territory. It captured Mosul and Nineveh and Arar, I'm not recalling, and another very large city. So it controls large cities. Mosul is in Iraq. It has taken over the civil administration of the territory. That means the Sunni administrators, civil servants, are working now for the Islamic State. So it's a functioning state as far as we can tell. It reestablished electricity supply, which when all the troubles had gone out most of the time. So they're having some civil successes, reestablishing order in their territory. They export oil, having captured oil fields and functioning oil wells, and they control 40% of Iraq's wheat supply. In other words, they seized a good portion of the breadbasket of Iraq. They earn this was in the newspaper the other day, their revenues are bringing in $1 to $3 million a day, probably from that oil export. And they may control assets of $2 billion. When they captured Mosul, they seized some of the important banks. It's not clear what they got when they did that. But they've got some wealth to back up their status as a territory. And they seem to be gaining popular support among Sunni Muslims in their territory. Not least of all in that they have driven out, there's no civil war inside their territory, which finally means that things have settled down for those areas. So that's sort of what happened in the last 15 years. Now, I want to, part 3, go back to the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, when Sunni Islam was put together in its foundation, theoretic foundations, and thus for the next 10,000 years, down to the time of the Western imperialism and colonization. So here's the theory. I tried to illustrate it in a simple chart with both some of the Arabic words and English words. The goal here is, notice the word Sharia. That's the word that I read from the Quran, meaning straight path. So the ideal for a Sunni Muslim is to live on the straight path that will lead you to God in paradise, and it's the path designed by God. So how do you get yourself on that path? Well, everything on that path has got to come from God. That's why I put God as the derivation at the top. Now, God, during Muhammad's lifetime, revealed to him what Muhammad recited. That's the Quran. So the foundational instruction and guidance from God is the Quran, the recitation of God's words. But Sunni Muslims have decided, of course, that's a document limited in time and place to Central Arabia in the middle of the beginning of the 7th century. So they needed more than just the Quran to give a complete, comprehensive program for staying on God's path. So what they did then decide is that they would follow the example of Muhammad himself. So over and above the Quran, if Muhammad did something or said something, that then becomes normative for the community. And if you follow the Sunnah, you're a Sunni, you follow what Muhammad said or what he did, then you're doing what God wants and you're on the path. But then, of course, as centuries pass, how do they know what Muhammad said and did? And that's why under the word Sunnah, practice of Muhammad, I put hadith. They collected reports, huge volumes, and the scholars worked for centuries trying to find out through a process of historical research, what did Muhammad say and do? And thus, the word under that is reporters. They verified a chain of reporters. If someone says, Muhammad said, wash before you go into the mosque, they would only accept that report if they could verify who saw Muhammad wash his hands before he went into the mosque. And then you had to trace that there were genuine, real Muslims in every generation that handed that on to the time it was written down. Now, of course, then that becomes a huge collection. I have several in my office. They're online. You can get them in apps of these hadiths, things that Muhammad said and did, which guide the community. But again, continually, new situations arise, and thus they use the principle of analogy. They compare what Muhammad said and did, compare what the Quran says, and then try and extend it by saying, this situation is like that situation. And if you could then establish that it was a strong analogy, then you could say, let's do it based on the fact that Muhammad did it this way. This situation is similar. We'll do it similarly to the way Muhammad did. That's analogy. But of course, people are very clever using analogies, and this is where the word agreement comes in. Only the analogies could be used that the community agreed on. And in Islamic civilization, agreement is like virtual unanimity. It would be as if our Supreme Court with 9 members couldn't have a 5-4 decision, instead to have a 9-zip. Now, how often does that happens? But not often. The more difficult the question, the longer it would take to get a decision. And they're willing to wait for the decisions to come. A simple example. The printing press was invented according to law 1453. The first Quran was printed in 1489. The calligraphers objected to the printing of it. They went to the scholars, and the scholars couldn't agree on whether you could print a Quran until almost unanimity was achieved in the 1920s. Now you could do 2 things, not print a Quran, or print a Quran and not be on the divinely guided path. So as time goes on, more and more practices of the people are not on the divinely guided path. Instead, they're what we're doing because we have no choice. You have to do it. It's the way you do it. And that creates a sort of a wedge. And as the wedge then gets double wedged when Western imperialism takes over most of the Muslim world. So the key word here, ijtihad. That's an inquiry about whether such and such an item, action, practice, is on the divinely guided way of life or not. And you make that inquiry to a mujtahid who is learned, a faqih in jurisprudence. That is, how do you make decisions? And then it's all leading to a fatwa, an advisory decision from someone who can study the sources and decide, balancing off the Quran and the Sunnah, the analogy and the agreement, and then you could make a decision. However, in the 11th century, by the 11th century, 12th century, different schools of interpretation had arisen. They're on the next page. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. But the schools began to do what schools of law, legal thinking do, is they began to use precedent only. So if you had a question, you always had to rely on the precedent. And then the precedents become binding. It'd be something like our Supreme Court deciding, because of the 1950 to 51 decision, or 52 decision about desegregation, that principle stands. Then you have to build on that. You have to build on that. You can't go erasing previous decisions. You can build on it, but you can't erase them. But, and I should have written that in there, next to ijtihad, I want to put taqlid, or lead, T-A-Q-L-I-D. It means they closed open inquiry. So the foundations for the Sunni practice of the Sharia, the divinely guided way of life, were basically within 400 to 500 years after Muhammad's death. And for the next 500 years, down to the time of the Great Reversal, that pattern was the way Muslims lived their lives. And it formed and shaped one of the great world civilizations roughly corresponding to our Middle Ages, the Western European Renaissance, and then the early modern period down to 1690 or so. Okay, now just a quote or two here. Ash-Shafi'i, one of the great, and we lack a good translation for this. I'm calling it jurisprudence, prudent application of law. Here's what he said. He died in 820. Whatever the apostle has decreed, that's sunnah, that is not based on any scriptural command of God, that is not found in the Quran, he has done so by God's command. That's the foundation of Sunnism. That's really the definition of the Sunni Muslim. So God instructed us in his saying, and verily thou, Muhammad, wilt guide mankind to a straight path, the path of God. For the apostle has laid down a sunnah on matters for which there is a text in the book of God, as well as for others concerning which there is no specific text from the Quran. But wherever he laid down in the sunnah, God ordered us to obey. And he regards our obedience to him as obedience to him. Our obedience to Muhammad is obedience to God. And our refusal to obey him as disobedience to him, for which no man will be forgiven, nor is an excuse for failure to obey God's sunnah possible. Now, that's a pretty strong statement. But on the other hand, we have the statement from the Fiqh Akbar that we do not consider anyone to be an infidel on account of sin. And that's the same man. Ash-Shafi'i said both of those. So there's the tension over the last 1,200 years in Islam. A man from the 15th century, 14th and 15th century, Ibn Khaldun, a great historian, political thinker, he said, jurisprudence is the knowledge of the classification of the laws of God, which concerns the actions of all responsible Muslims as obligatory or forbidden or recommendable or disliked or permissible. Those are the categories. These laws are derived from the Quran and the prophetic hadiths, that's the reports, meaning the sunnah, and from the evidence of the lawgiver, that is Muhammad, has established for a knowledge of the law. The law evolved from the whole of this evidence is called jurisprudence. That's the Islamic way of life as guided by the Sunnah and the Quran of Muhammad, and you thus are a Sunni Muslim on the Sharia, the divinely guided way of life. Now in part 5, I put down a number of the great schools of jurisprudence, and they're usually found in certain regions where they predominate. In a country like Egypt, each family can choose or has their own school of jurisprudence, and if you go to the Islamic scholars, they will adapt the one you have and give you a ruling based on that school. However, in Central Arabia, the Hanbali school predominated. And the Hanbali school, Ibn Hanbal, who died in 855, he would not go along with taqlid, that you couldn't continue to make inquiries, or the reverse, you didn't have to follow the established precedents. So you could go back to the Quran, you could go back to the Sunnah of Muhammad, you could study the hadiths and make fresh, new applications, and not be bound by 4, 5, in present day, 1,400 years of legal precedents. Okay, now I won't go into detail in those 4, but you can see how they differ in emphasis, but particularly Hanbal school. Now that's in the 9th century. 8 centuries later, in Central Arabia, a man named Wahhab, who was originally a Sufi, a mystic, traveled around the Muslim world and came back to Central Arabia, and he started his own new school of interpretation. So, and this is called, use the English word, the Unitarian. There's extreme emphasis on the unity of God. So Wahhab, and he was protected by a man who had a long lineage right down to the present, a man named Saud. And of course, this is the origin of the Saudi Arabian royal family 2 centuries ago. So the Unitarians do not accept the other 4 schools of jurisprudence, but is close to the Hanbal school because they will not accept the dominance of established precedents. they declared other Muslims to be apostates. And in classical Sharia law, and even in the Sunni, someone who disbelieved after having believed was to be executed after a due trial. So they are not really Muslims. And this is takfir, a declaration that another nominal Muslim is not a Muslim. And the Arabic word for an unbeliever, most of us are unbelievers, we're fakirs. So takfir is this declaration that a Muslim is an unbeliever outside the community. Now that's in direct opposition to the statement that, back in the beginning, we do not consider anyone to be an infidel, an unbeliever, on account of sin. This rocked the Sunni Muslim world, this established principle. So it's close to the, where am I? Okay, no longer a Muslim. Accepts only the teachings of Muhammad and his companions. And in fact, wipes out in 1700s, 12 centuries of Muslim jurisprudence. And all those precedents, a single blow, just wiped out. The practices of later generations are bid'ah, objectionable. Rejects ijma, that is agreement, and rejects taqlid, that is the bindingness of established precedents. Reopens ijtihad. Anybody can go back in and read the sources and make new decisions. Particularly because he had been a Sufi. The Saudi, now all following the Wahhab school, went on a rampage, and after Napoleon left Egypt in 1801, they were able to come, and the Ottoman Empire was weakened, and they came in and seized Mecca and Medina, the holy cities, and particularly they destroyed tombs where people were worshiping saints, in other words, substituting them for God, when they should be worshiping God alone. That's idolatry. So, but those were the tombs of Muslim saints, including the tomb of Muhammad, which is in Medina, the city of Medina. So they reject Sufism, they reject the visiting of tombs, the idea of saints, and wherever they're established, they use enforcers, that is, religious police, to get external conformity. Any person can read and understand the Quran and the Hadiths. Now, when the Ottomans reestablished authority after Napoleon left, they sent an army down and swept the Saudi Wahhabis back into the desert, where they just went back for another century and a half. But they came out again at the time, right after the First World War, and they established Saudi Arabia, which includes control of the holy cities of Medina and Mecca, and thus control of everyone who goes on pilgrimage, the Hajj, every year during the month of pilgrimage, and thus the Wahhab message, in incredible cross purposes to the whole 14 centuries of Islamic jurisprudence, was at odds with one another, and that message was being spread around the world. The Saudi government is very interested. If we could write to the Saudi embassy, they would send everybody in this room a copy of the Quran. Beautiful edition, but would have all the Wahhabi interpretations in the footnotes. So that's a tremendous source of the ideology lying behind a lot of the newly emergent Muslim groups. Now let me say something, watch my time here, about jihad and then takfir. Arabic root for jihad is struggle, and many, or effort, and many of the contexts in which the word is used would just be like our using the word struggle or effort. And thus it can mean a spiritual struggle, the struggle inside of one to live up to the ideals of the Sharia, the divinely guided way of life. But it also means, and was used in the time of Muhammad, for the struggle he had militarily in the war that broke out between his enemies in Mecca and himself in Medina. So there are many passages in the Quran about that struggle, about that jihad. So it also means, and usually translated into English, holy war. And it is the only, according to the Sunni mainstream, is the only legal warfare that you can do on the Sharia. So if you fight for Syria or fight for Iraq, you're not on the holy Sharia. That's not a holy war. If you fought, many Muslims fought for the British or for the French. Those weren't holy wars. So there's a very specific definition of a holy war. It must be authorized by appropriate Muslim authority. And of course, with the establishment of countries, that's what has become so problematic. The president of Syria is not an appropriate Muslim authority. Saddam Hussein was not an appropriate Muslim authority. He could not, in his wars, practice jihad. And then it can be used to extend the rule of Islam or to defend Islam. It must have a reasonable chance of success. There is to be no jihad against Muslims, only against unbelievers, basically to defend Islam or to extend Islam. Non-combatants are to be protected, although Al-Qaeda does not accept that interpretation. Even though that's been the interpretation for 12 or 14 centuries, Al-Qaeda feels free to go back in, look at the sources, and decide that that principle isn't to be held. So jihad presumes an army. So it's not just anybody getting a gun or a sword and running off and into a struggle. So it has to be legitimate force from an appropriate Muslim authority. Soldiers in the other army must be invited to embrace Islam before you can have a true jihad. So your enemies have to have the choice to accept Islam. And there's another saying of Muhammad, there is no, it's in the Quran, there is no compulsion in matters of religion. So you give people the choice, you can't compel them. But if they decide they can live their own religion under the rule of Muslims, and they are then part of a protected group. And this is called dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I. And the only thing is you can live under the Muslim rule and pay a special tax. And then the government will protect you. So technically all those Christians in Syria and Iraq and in Egypt down the centuries have been protected people. But if you don't accept Islam, or if you don't become a dhimmi, then the war can go on. And you can kill the people on the other side in the legal system that the Sharia and its fiqh present. Shiites do not practice jihad since the imam is in hiding or occultation. There is no appropriate authority in the Shiite realm. That means the southern Iraqis who are Shiites cannot fight in a jihad, and nobody will proclaim it for them. Now, takfir, this principle that you can declare a nominal Muslim not to be a Muslim, is originally a Shiite practice, but from the 18th century it spread to some Sunnis, and that is a pronouncement that a person, I have a mistake there, a person nominally a Muslim is not a real Muslim, but an unbeliever. And this spread through the Wahhabi interpretation, which now, since 1924, they control Mecca, the Hajj, and all the people who come, and they're subject to this propaganda from this point of view. Traditional Sharia-minded Muslims consider this a doctrinal deviation. Again, I just quote the original thing I said there, have there. We do not consider anyone to be an infidel on account of sin. So, now in part 7, I talk about Wahhab, Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was from a Yemeni family that immigrated into Saudi Arabia when it was established, and they became very wealthy in construction. Of course, Saudi Arabia has rapidly developed over the last 70 years, and Osama bin Laden's father became very wealthy. It's not quite clear what influenced Osama bin Laden intellectually. It might be the Muslim Brotherhood, or it might be extreme Wahhabis, and he was raised in a Wahhabi country. But in any case, when the Russians, the Soviet communists, tried to take over Afghanistan, he was among the jihadis who went to Afghanistan, and eventually, of course, with massive billions of dollars of American help, they overthrew the Russians, and the Russians left. And that led to the fall, partly to the fall of communism in the late 1980s. So he had upfront contact with the CIA and with American operatives, extending money and weapons usually through the path of giving them to Pakistan, and then they were sent to Afghanistan. So he fought as a jihadi in Afghanistan. He worked for the reinstitution of Sharia instead of the westernized constitutions of contemporary Muslim states. In his view, the only real Muslim state was the Muslim state in Afghanistan conducted by the Taliban, which was not run according to Western rules. He reinterpreted jihad as war against the enemies of Islam, that is the United States. Particularly when the first Gulf War in the United States, under the permission of the Saudi government, allowed a couple 100,000 American soldiers to set up force in Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and French and English as well. He thought they had betrayed their whole religion in allowing the unbelievers to attack another Muslim country, Iraq, from the sacred territory that guarded Mecca and Medina. So he declared jihad against the Saudi government, the United States and all of its influence. So, and he toyed with the idea of eventually reestablishing a caliphate. He accepted the Wahhabi teaching of takfir, and he declared jihad against the Saudi government, American interests, and then, of course, Israel, as being either the Americans are a pawn of Israel or Israel is a pawn of Americans, some interpretation like that. Okay. The Islamic State, and I just went through the genealogy of their gradual being influenced by al-Qaeda and then separating mutually back and forth, al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So it's a permutation of Wahhabism and of al-Qaeda. Instead of a terrorist war of attrition with the unbelieving West, the Islamic State is premised on establishing a territory where the Sharia can be strictly practiced and enforced and under the leadership of renewed caliphate. Thus, jihad is reoriented to Muslims who are declared to be takfir. It's not against the great unbelievers, the United States and Israel. It's against fellow Muslims who would resist the formation of this Islamic State. It is modern in its notion of state. The state has a monopoly of use of legitimate violence, and which is a cross between the traditional Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam, and the contemporary idea of the nation state. So what was really fascinating to me back in July when I first began hearing about the Islamic State was that word state and what it implies. Now, in September, there was this open letter, and I have the conclusion of the open letter. And it goes on for 17 pages. They answer point by point by point. On the next page is an executive summary of the open letter. And you can see how detailed it is. And it would conform to our general knowledge that we've picked up from our media about what the Islamic State is doing. But here's the final quote here. Islam is mercy. Now you say something like that because you have a specific context. And this specific context is their horror at the deviation from traditional Sunni practice that the Islamic State represents. But that's also true about what al-Qaeda represents. And it's also a real knock at Wahhabism in this conclusion. Islam is mercy, and its attributes are merciful. The Prophet, who was sent as a mercy for all worlds, summarized a Muslim's dealings with others by saying, "He who shows no mercy will not be shown mercy. And have mercy, and you will be shown mercy. But you have misinterpreted Islam into a religion of harshness, brutality, torture, and murder." And this was addressed, the opening line was, to Caliph Ibrahim and to all of his fighters. But you have misinterpreted Islam into a religion of harshness, brutality, torture, and murder. This is all a great wrong and an offense to Islam, to Muslims, and to the entire world. Reconsider all your actions, desist from them, cease harming others, and return to the religion of mercy. Now, you can just see the whole list of things that they're objecting to in the practice on that last page of the executive summary from this open letter. Now, I would conclude, this is a huge intellectual and ideological struggle going on within the Muslim world. Just to make a simple application. How Islamic is the Islamic State? The open letter, all those Islamic scholars from the Sunni tradition from around the world, including Americans, say, of course, it's Islamic to the extent that they're Muslims, even though they have deviated from the traditional interpretation of the Sunni practice of the Sharia, the divinely guided way of life. The Islamic State would answer back to this, and I have the 129 names of all the scholars here. You are not Muslims because you've brought in these objectionable practices for the last 14 centuries and are not in the spirit and the letter of what Muhammad and his early companions did, which should be the basis for the Sharia. And then that means they practice jihad, meaning warfare. The modern Sunni practice of declining warfare. And in the executive summary, they say two things. One is, one thing's implied. They say another thing. They say that you can have a country, the last one there, or one of the last ones, loyalty to one's nation is permissible to Islam. Now that's a development by analogy from over 14 centuries. For the first 1,000, 1,200 years, there were no countries. So once that's established, then they can extend their, by jurisprudence, cover the new condition. The Islamic State wants to say, have it both ways. They want to set up a country, but they want it to be on the basis of the practice of Muhammad and his companions. In other words, return to the letter and the spirit of the first two generations of Muslims. So I started off saying it depends on who you ask and the perspective from which you're asking the question. As severe as that list is of all the errors of the Islamic State, from the point of view of the writers, they're still Muslims. They're not infidels. But from the point of view of the Islamic State, those who wrote the letter are infidels. So that's my conclusion. Thank you. And it'd be any comments or questions or?
Can you talk more about Sufism, kind of the Sufi tradition? In our class this week, we've been looking at kind of Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
Seeming very progressive, open Islam.
Yeah. Remember, the number varies, but let's say there's 1 billion, 400 million, 500 million Muslims. What Professor is talking about is, he had shown me an article. For example, Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim country, is a functioning democracy. And thus, there are some tensions within the country leading toward the type of Wahhabism or the extreme form associated with bin Laden. But the majority are practicing a fairly modern view. There's a lot of interpretations, but I would say one is the countries that have most recently become Muslim and that are not in an Arabic-speaking region tend to have the most liberal polities and have been most influenced. So there's a lot of ways to cut that. The article Mark is mentioning estimates that of the 500 million Muslims alive, maybe 500 million of them are living in functioning democracies. That would be modern westernized states, according to our interpretation. So it's perfectly compatible with their interpretation of how to be a Muslim. But of course, Islamic State would say, they're not Muslims. Because they're not basing their present practice of contemporary living on a Sharia, divinely guided way of life, based literally on the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad, meaning Muhammad and his first companions. So that's part of the struggle. Sufism.
Yeah.
Sufism, is strong in the newer countries, particularly Indonesia. It's very strong in a country like Egypt. But Egypt has and Cairo is the center of many of the Sufi orders. It's more people go on pilgrimage to the Sufi master tombs in Cairo than go to the Hajj in Mecca. So Sufism in Turkey has had a tremendous impact on the form of Islam. if a full description of the picture of Islam would have to take account of Sufism. But Sufism has been in tension with what I would call the Sunni jurisprudence since its establishment 13 centuries ago. And extreme Sufis deliberately will not do the practices of the Sharia as described by the Sunnis, precisely to make the point that Islam is a mystical religion, not a religion of external practice. So that would be another lecture, I think, to really get into Sufism. But it's very much part of the Muslim world. And it depends on where you are. Sufism in Iran, in the Shiite version, has had extreme impact on the contemporary practice of Islam in Iran, heavily in Turkey, and then in Egypt, and then in places like Indonesia, and elsewhere, not that it's limited. But Sufism tends to be apolitical, and of course, an apolitical form of Islam would feed into separation of mosque and state, if you want to use a phrase like that, because they don't stake their essential definition of Islam based on the practice of an external community and what it does. Make sense?
Yeah. And it really does focus on this. You talk about the no compulsion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that they really fixate on, or is that too simple?
I'd want to be a much greater scholar of this than I am, because historical context, time and place determine what you find and think important when you're reading a document. So modernizing forms of Islam, going back to the middle of the 1850s under the British rule, have been trying to find a way to accommodate all these new developments. And then all of a sudden that passage becomes a very important one. And receives a lot more attention than it would have in, like when the Crusaders were romping all over the Middle East, Christian invaders. You would find something different. The jihad passages would receive more attention. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, the word Sunni obviously means you follow the Sunnah of Muhammad. The word Shiite means, the ITE is not in Arabic, that's an English anglicization. The word Shia means faction or party, and it's the party of Ali, who was the fourth caliph. And Ali was the son-in-law, he married Muhammad's daughter, and the Shiites believed that Muhammad was to be succeeded by the descendants of Muhammad himself. And thus the party of, and those descendants, in every generation is one who should be the leader of all Muslims from the lineage of Muhammad. So Shiites believe that there is someone alive today who is a descendant of Muhammad, except he's been in hiding. And someday he will appear, and this is what they call the Imam Mahdi. And thus they're looking, similar to possibly related to, but similar to the Christian expectation of return of Christ. They would have the view of the return of the Mahdi. And they've always felt oppressed by the Sunnis. And the Sunnis have tried to eradicate that view. And again in the 1690s, a Shiite dynasty took over in Iran, and eventually Iran became a 90% Shiite country. It's the only country probably in the world, except for Iraq, that has a majority of Shiites. So it's a very different type of tradition, because there's almost a mystical quality to being a descendant of Muhammad in the main lineage. So Ali was killed, and then his son Hussein was killed at the Battle of Karbala, and then his son, and then his son. That's the lineage of the Shiites. And there were 12 of them, 12 generations. It took almost 200 years, 230 years for the generation. The 12th Imam, no, the 11th Imam, before he died, had a son, and would not publicly acknowledge him because he feared the Sunnis would capture him and kill him. So then this is what the Iranians are called 12er Shiites, because they think there have been 12 Imams. The 12th was never appeared, but since the world still functions, he's alive, just not appearing. But someday he will reappear. So it's a much more mystical, mysterious, almost a Gnostic form of Islam found in Iran. And of course, what do you think the Wahhabis think of that? They're fakirs, unbelievers. Because they haven't emphasized the unity of God. Instead, they've replaced it with secondary figures, family of Muhammad. So that's, again, another lecture. Shiism is very interested. John?
Yeah, under what conditions would
Pardon me?
under what conditions would the 12 imams show up or descendants?
There are, it'd be in the mystical writings in Persian and Arabic in Iran, when Ayatollah Khomeini flew back from Paris to take control of the country, and they set up what in our category we call theocracy. He's the representative of God. He refused to be acknowledged as the Mahdi, Imam and Mahdi. He was instead the representative. If the Imam Mahdi were to show up, the current Ayatollah would just, recede into the background. But I'm not sure how they would know. I'm a little amused. I'm thinking of these rapture movies. How would you know the rapture occurred? Especially if you didn't go. So, I mean, it's a very mysterious thing about the Imam Mahdi. But there have been people who claim to be the Mahdi. In 1898, the British fought in Sudan against the Mahdi. Hundreds of thousands of Sudanese Muslims adhered to him. They fought one of the great battles, the Battle of Khartoum in 1898. Utterly defeated that movement. The British took over Sudan. So from time to time, someone claims to be the Mahdi. Yeah.
Follow up on your answer, there are few writings that suggest what conditions would appear. Some say that a man will be killed in Mecca, and there will be a lot of blood in Mecca.
Mm-hmm.
That would be one sign, and there would be 325 true Islam believers that would potentially be his soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And when injustice takes over the world, that's when he'll appear.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a question, who is Umar al-Khattab, and what's his relationship to Sunnah?
I'd have to look that up. I'm not sure. I would follow up on what she just said, though. In 1898, that man couldn't have been the Mahdi. He was defeated by the unbelievers. So, and in Shiism in general, there is an expectation that since they've had to go underground and lived in oppressed states for so many centuries, there is that take up your cross and follow me type of idea that, of course, the Sunnis are going to prevail. And then there's sort of like an Armageddon, I think you mentioned it, idea. It's got to get really bad, then he's going to come. So then they might be looking for the signs of the end of the world. Those evangelical Christians that think, well, the Jews all got to go back to Israel. Then you can have the end of the world, the coming of Christ. So I think that's a good answer. Thank you. Any other questions? Mark?
Can you talk a little about, Wahhabism is centered in Saudi Arabia, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So at some level, it seems like kind of the current geopolitics of this, if we can get to that a little bit. Certainly there's a tension between the United States supporting Saudi Arabia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at the one hand, fighting it, and on the one hand, it's supporting the kind of the ideology or the center of this,
Mm-hmm.
this interpretation, correct?
Yeah. Well, ironically, except for the Taliban, Saudi Arabia might be the strictest enforcer of that type of view of Sharia, but it's not what it was in 1924. It's much, much watered down. The original Wahhab would not allow Muslims to listen to music. So music was prohibited. Now, every car imported from Germany or from Japan has a radio. And there's, so time and time again, many of the strict practices have been abandoned. But it's still one of the stricter places, in the Muslim world for the practice of the strict construction Sharia. There's no provision in the Sharia or the Quran to have a king. So here is the Saudi Arabian kingdom, and it's actually Arabia is the personal possession of the Saudi family. So in your article, you're talking about a sultanate principle. It's run like a family business, the whole country. But they had allied back to the middle of the 1700s with Wahhabism. So the irony is you could go to the schools and learn the strict instruction, but the government is only practicing a mild version of it. And that's why someone like Osama bin Laden could turn on his own government. And for reasons of necessity, the Saudis did not think they could protect themselves. Remember, in the first Gulf War, they were concerned and welcomed the Americans to come in because they were concerned that Saddam Hussein would seize the oil fields in eastern Arabia after invading Kuwait. And they had no army that could stop them. So I guess realpolitik set in. We need allies. And they got judgments from their muftis saying it was acceptable, fatwas that said it was acceptable to invite the Americans in. One thing I didn't mention, and it's very significant for this adaptable mainstream Sunni tradition, from 1690 to 1920, when all the 90% of the Muslim world was colonized, for the most part, no one declared a jihad. You could be ruled by an unbeliever as long as the unbeliever allowed you the practice of Islam. But then you see it's a truncated practice of Islam, because in the Sharia, Muslims are to be ruled by Muslims, not by unbelievers. But they also say that you may not rebel against an authority. That's in the executive summary. You may not rebel against an authority if they will allow the practice of Islam. And of course, the traditional principle was nobody in Syria should be rebelling against Assad. He is the legitimate government, and no matter how oppressive he is, the general, I guess, would be a passive approach to obedience to an unjust government. But if he were, or either the colonial British or Assad or somebody would say, you may not pray at the mosque, that would cut at the heart of it, and that would then be occasion for revolt. So in places like Iraq and Syria, Lebanon for that matter, and I guess Palestine, or Israel and the Palestinian Authority as well, the most traditional Muslims are these Sunni Muslim jurists who control the great universities in Egypt, where you learn about the Sharia and the fiqh and the practice of interpretation. They're all controlled by the traditionalists, but the government is run according to military needs, good order needs, etc. In this great, I'm calling it a great reversal. All these countries, Egypt and Tunisia, just from the Arab Spring, have just established new constitutions for the ordering of the government after the Arab Spring. But there's no provision in the Sharia for a constitution. The Sharia itself is supposed to be the constitution. And then in the Sharia, the Ummah, the entire community of Muslims, should form one community with one leader, which would be all 1,500,000,000 people, shouldn't be dividing their loyalty between a country and their community. Although, reading that executive summary, it looks like they've begun to make an accommodation to that principle. That means that for the 129 who wrote that document, the open letter, they've begun to bring into their theorizing the notion that you can belong to a country and be a Muslim, which is quite a radical thing, although people have been doing it for 3 centuries. And that's the problem, I think, with the great Sunni practice of consensus. They mentioned that slavery was outlawed. Slavery is no longer acceptable in Islam since the 19th century. But the scholars got unanimity or agreement by the 19th century, and therefore it's now an accepted principle that slavery is not part of the divinely guided way of life. If given enough time, and of course if you read in the New York Times and all the journals, commentators are wondering how long will it take for a dominating political center to the Islamic countries that will accept something like our practice of the division of church and state, which was never part of their theory, and they're practicing it before they can theorize about it, because the principle of consensus is virtual unanimity. And then, of course, they offset that by saying it's a blessing from God when we have dissension in the community. And you have to wait in God's good time for the consensus to emerge. So if decolonization began after the Second World War, that's only 70 years ago. So perhaps enough time has not. And every time one of those countries was let loose from the colonial power, they adopted usually a constitution based on the colonial powers, or an adaptation of that. That's why I think our dominant ideology in our own society is so invisible to us, we don't see it. And that's why we make such negative judgments about various Muslim groups who don't share our invisible dominating ideology. And that's that there be a nation state everywhere and everyone's a citizen. And you can die for your country, but you can't die for God. Now, does anybody ever say that? No. But that's the operating principle, I think, in most of the United Nations. And that's why in our own country, no religious group has any access to the utilization of force or violence. The government can do that. Local communities or denominations or churches can't. The Islamic State is trying to coalesce the two. So then the legitimate use of force, which most people are denouncing as barbarism, our president said they should be eradicated. If we don't understand what they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it and how they see themselves in this operation. And I think that's why every time I go through our airport down here in Portland, that's exactly where Muhammad Atta got on the plane and flew to Boston and then down to the World Trade Center. And he was praying the whole time he was going. So we need to understand, what was he praying? How was he praying? Why was he praying?
You said he was praying when he was flying the plane?
I don't think he had companions. I don't know who actually flew the plane. It might have been Muhammad Atta. But the people who saw him, and he left behind a note, a letter, saying what he was doing and why. On the plane from, Portland to Logan, the witnesses said they saw him praying.
You said the U.S. played a big part in helping Osama bin Laden when he was in Russia, with Russia conflict in Afghanistan. What do you think motivated the U.S. to say that Osama bin Laden was behind the 9/11 attacks?
Repeat that, please, Dave.
The question was, given that Osama bin Laden had been related to the American effort to support the opposition to Russia in Afghanistan, I guess the question is, what motivated him?
What motivated the U.S. to blame bin Laden for the attacks?
Well, I think they have direct evidence through listening devices, et cetera, that he actually planned it. And this, of course he's dead, but his successor was in on it as well. I don't think that's a guesstimate. I think they have very direct evidence, either through intercepted messages and things like that. So I don't think it's doubtful that Osama bin Laden was the the planner and the motivator for the 9/11 attack.
What do you think motivated him to attack us when we helped him out in Russia?
After the Russian expulsion from Afghanistan, the United States unbelievers, women dressed like men in military uniforms, a couple 100,000 of them went into his country, which was the extreme holy place. Should have been. And you remember, at the heart of Saudi Arabia, in western central Saudi Arabia, is the city of Mecca, where no unbeliever is allowed to go. And then by extension, the whole country is the protector of that holy spot. So he had very, very, was just utterly disagreed with the presence of the United States. Of course, it wasn't just the United States, the French, the British, the Egyptians were also involved.
All the non-believers.
According to that definition. I think the crucial thing that hasn't come out, at least in my reading of most of American media, is the idea that Muslims are fighting about what it means to be a Muslim. And that drives then how you then proceed. Now this is related to Shiism, but when early on in the American occupation of Iraq, the mosque at Najaf was blown up. And for the first time, Muslims in the southern part of Iraq, Shiite territory, it was a horror that a Muslim would blow up a mosque. And the people didn't say, the mob that went down the street, in mourning and everything, they just said, the Wahhabis, the Wahhabis. It'd have to be somebody who didn't think it was a mosque. Now, it could have been Americans, but there was no reason why the Americans would blow up the mosque. So I don't think they know who actually blew up the mosque. Could have been a Sunni. But the initial reaction was Wahhabis. And when you say the word Wahhabi, you're not necessarily saying a Saudi Arabian citizen. It could be somebody who lives elsewhere. But it was just a horror that you would think somebody would blow up a mosque who was a Muslim. And they drew the conclusion it must be someone who considers us not Muslims. And that's quite clear that the Islamic State does not consider the Shiites Muslims. And I think that's going to be a test whether they go into or try and get into Baghdad, because the areas they control are most of the Sunni areas of Iraq, with the exception of the Kurdish areas in the northeast, and then the south, which is Shiite. It would really test the ability of their state and the cohesion of it if they were to occupy big Shiite areas, and then what are they going to do with all those people? They might do ethnic cleansing, push them out, something like that. But I'm pretty sure they do not want large numbers of Shiites inside the Islamic State. A very recent development has been that people in the other parts of the Muslim world are declaring themselves adherent to the Islamic State, even if they're not in territorial, contiguous to it. A group in Libya has done that. There's a group in Saudi Arabia. I'm pretty sure the Saudi police are down their necks, trying to claim the connection. And in western Iraq flows right down and has a border, extensive border with Saudi Arabia, and the same type of Sunni Arab tribes are on both sides of the border. So it could be that if the Islamic State has staying power, it's really going to upset and have a potential, revanchism from the tribes on the other side of those borders. I might mention one thing. This is the legacy, the terrible, terrible legacy of the British and the French after the First World War. Because the line, if you look at Iraq and Syria, Jordan, they're all straight lines. So French diplomat Picot and English diplomat Sykes betrayed Lawrence of Arabia, who had promised the pan-Arabic state, and they decided the French could have Syria and Lebanon, the British would have Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. And then, let's get a ruler. You can have what's on this side. Well, those went right down the middle of religious and tribal groups all over the Middle East. So, and you can see it with there's Kurds in Iraq, there's Kurds in Syria, there's Kurds in Turkey. There's Sunni on both sides of those lines. And even the Turkish border is very arbitrary as well. And deep in the souls of the people, the more traditional-minded people, is, what are these lines? Before 1920, they were part of the Ottoman Empire. They were just provinces. They were local governmental jurisdictions. They weren't states that had legitimate use of demand for controlled violence. Now they are. So it's a huge, huge mess, I think, geopolitically in every which way. And it seems, if I can pontificate a little bit, the United States, if we touch it, we make it worse. But we can't not touch it. So we're in a huge bind too. And the Islamic State is a very interesting development. It might prove unstable, collapse, which is already done once and then come back. But if it does, perhaps with the wealth, I mentioned in the paper that they've seized from the Iraqi army American tanks. And perhaps that might even have, they're supposedly training pilots to fly some of the jet planes and the helicopters they've captured. There's an outside chance that they could last, they could stay there. And then we have everybody in the whole Middle East and everybody, we all have a huge problem destabilizing. On the one hand, it will stabilize their area, but it will destabilize all the surrounding areas. Mary Lynn.
In your executive summary, points 10 and 11, you mentioned people of the scripture, and I was wondering what that means.
Yeah, that's not me. That's the executive summary from that was attached to the open letter. The Quran and Muhammad's own practice, so the Quran and his Sunnah, he allowed anyone who had had a prophet, and especially prophets mentioned in the Quran, thus Moses and Abraham, Jesus, John the Baptist, etc., although they may have perverted down through the centuries the true message of those prophets, they had the people of the book or the scriptures, they were to be protected. When Umar, the second caliph, took over Jerusalem, he allowed all the Christians to stay in place. He just established a basic principle. This is the dhimmi, and the Jews were in the same situation. Of course, the Zoroastrians were in the same situation, that they could keep the practice of their religion, their communities. They could pay the special tax. Of course, the Muslims were paying taxes too, so it was to equalize things. If they accepted the general rule of Islam and did not proselytize or evangelize, and they were to show no external signs of their symbols of their religion, like crosses on a church, then they could stay. And of course, in Palestine, in Iraq, and Syria, there are Christians there today who, when times were stable, were utterly protected and allowed to live their lives all these centuries. They're the descendants of the people who were there when the Islamic conquest took place in the 630s, 40s, and 50s. Michael.
Back to the political, it was widely reported that under Nouri al-Maliki, the Sunnis felt disenfranchised. And now with the election of a new prime minister, do you think that that could be reversed, or is it already too late?
I would presume it's too late. Probably 3/4 of the Sunni population is under Islamic State. So whoever's left within Baghdad and those provinces that remain, the Kurds are also separated. So that's very much a truncated state. Half the population of Iraq is in that territory. So I think it depends on whether the Islamic State has, enduring power to stay. Thus far, they've been militarily overwhelming the Iraqi army, the army we trained. So I don't think that there's a political situation, path forward that way. And it's undoubtedly that Maliki, favored the Shiites in a very disproportionate way. And of course, there was a civil war going on while it was and terrorism all over the place. But the Sunni had never been ruled by the Shiites in Iraq, ever. So what happened when the Americans came in and overthrew the situation? First time it ever happened. A Shiite can be ruled by a Sunni, but a Sunni shouldn't be ruled by a Shiite. And that's 14 centuries of history behind that one. So there's something. Now, people always make their accommodations to to real power and things like that, but they resent it immensely. I remember Saddam Hussein, that was a Sunni regime. Although it was a secular regime, it was still heavily Sunni. But on the other hand, there's always another hand. The Shiites fought in Saddam Hussein's army in the war that they fought with Iran. Hundreds of thousands of people died for their country, not Shiites fighting Shiites. So, I think there's a tendency to, what they call facts on the ground are different than the theories. And so I've been trying to get at the theory behind these new jihadi movements, or like the Islamic State. But what's actually and that's a caution. They've been beheading journalists. So who's in there reporting on what's going on down there? I'm sure. I was reading that our government regrets that we've lost so many of our intelligence assets in those regions as we've pulled back. So we don't, some of these reports. Baghdadi was supposed to have been killed in an air attack last week, and that was apparently false report. So I think you'd have to be cautious about anything you would say on the actual what's likely to happen or what is happening right now. They're not at all embarrassed. Apparently, they have a very effective propaganda agency using the internet and the social media. And these beheadings, I don't think, are aimed at us. The Americans are so horrified about the beheadings. That's a propaganda target at the Islamic world, saying if you really believe this is how far you should go. So I think, the dismay of the American population doesn't mean a thing to them.
How many beheadings were there in America already?
I don't think anybody's been beheaded in America. There are Americans in Syria.
Workplace beheaded in New York? They called it workplace violence. Jews beheaded in New York?
I'm not familiar with that.
There's been a few beheadings.
Yeah.
So I think we should all be worried and take preventative measures just in case.
Beheading was the standard humane way of executing people right down to this century. The French guillotine, it was considered for crimes, yeah.
Crimes, not just for what you believe in.
So we shouldn't, I was talking with Mark, I don't think we should have a particularly visual reaction to somebody being beheaded. The question is whether they're guilty or not.
There was a woman at work by a guy who said she wasn't a believer.
That's, again, we might say the collateral damage, because it's hard to tell whether it's just a rogue individual being influenced. That's some of the questions about the people trying to get to Syria. The guy who went on a rampage in Ottawa, was he a member of an organization? Wasn't he? Was he just reading his internet, and social media?
There's an announcement from one of the leaders, ISIL, saying, hey, behead all non-believers.
I read it too. I haven't done it.
But I mean, people that believe that way, you're going to activate, right?
Yeah. I should mention, and that's what was this business about Indonesia, 90% of Muslims, Indonesia has got more than 200 million people. There are well more than almost 190 million Muslims in India. If you include Bangladesh, there's another almost 200 million. That's 600 million Muslims. Most of Central Asia, the Muslims of the former Soviet Union are not involved directly in this struggle, or not yet. So I think it's easy to say that probably 98% of all Muslims alive are not in these jihadi movements. Although, as you say, individuals can be influenced. Yeah. Well, we're going over time. I appreciate everybody coming. I hope this has been helpful. So thank you.